Born on June 12, 1933, in New Kensington, Pennsylvania, Eddie Adams didn't start showing interest in photography until he hit high school. After joining the photography staff at his school, he began to also shoot weddings and portraits in his spare time. He then graduated and enlisted in the U.S. Marine Corps, where he spent 3 years as a combat photographer during the Korean War. Immediately following the war, one of his assignments was to photograph the entire demilitarized zone, which took him about a month to complete. Also, while on assignment for the Associated Press, he carried his camera through 150 operations in Vietnam. It also covered wars in Israel, Jordan, Egypt, Turkey, Cyprus, Portugal, Ireland, Lebanon, and Kuwait. However, it was during the Vietnam War, while working for the Associated Press, when Adams captured his Pulitzer Prize-winning photograph of a South Vietnamese officer shooting a Viet Cong prisoner. The photograph came with the caption, "General Lone executing a Viet Cong prisoner in Saigon," and was depicting an execution on the streets of Saigon on February 1, 1968, the Vietnamese New Year, during the opening stages of the Tet Offensive. The photo then went on to be one of the most notable photographs of the 20th century. It started when General Lone walked into Adams' frame, raising a pistol, which was normally a method of interrogation, but the general pulled the trigger. One of the frames was actually the bullet entering the man's head, the moment of death. Hal Buell, who ran the Associated Press photo services for 23 years, says the Vietnam War was a turning point for the war photographers like Adams. No war was ever photographed the way Vietnam was photographed, he says. There was no censorship. All a photographer had to do, says Buell, is convince a helicopter pilot to let him get on board a chopper going out to a battle scene. So photographers had incredible access, which you don't get anymore. Former AP and CNN correspondent Peter Arnay was with Adams during the war. He says that some 60 journalists and photographers were killed in Vietnam. He explained that this was the last great service war, and there was tremendous competition between United Press International and the Associated Press. Adams was only in Vietnam for a year, which wasn't long enough because he went back to South Vietnam in 1967 near the capital of Saigon. Adams won the 1969 Pulitzer Prize for Spot News Photography and a World Press Photo Award for the photograph. Writer and critic David D. Perlmutter stated that no film footage did as much damage as AP photographer Eddie Adams' 35mm shot taken on a Saigon street. When people talk or write about the Tet Offensive, at least a sentence is devoted to that photograph. Anticipating the impact of the photo, an attempt at retaliation was sought by editors in the New York Times. John G. Morris recalls in his memoirs that assistant managing editor Theodore M. Bernstein determined that the brutality manifested by America's ally be put into perspective, agreed to run the Adams picture large but offset with a photo of a child slain by Viet Cong, which just so happened to come through from AP at about the exact same time. Nonetheless, it was Adams' photograph that stood out and was remembered, while the other photo withered away in memory. Donald Winslow of the New York Times quotes Adams as having described the image as a reflex picture and wasn't certain of what he had photographed until the film was later developed. In 1998, Adams wrote in Time magazine on General Lone and his famous photograph. 2 people died in that photograph, the recipient of the bullet and General Lone. The general killed the Viet Cong. I killed the general with my camera. Still, photographs are the most powerful weapons in the world. People believe them, but photographs do lie. Even without manipulation, they are only half-truths. What the photograph didn't say was, what would you do if you were the general at that time and place on that hot day and you caught the so-called bad guy after he blew away 1, 2, 3 American people? This picture really messed up his life. He never blamed me. He told me if I hadn't taken the picture, someone else would have. but I felt bad for him and his family for a long time. I sent flowers when I heard that he had died and wrote, "I'm sorry, there are tears in my eyes." When General Lone died, Adams praised him as a hero of a just cause. He even once said, "I would have rather been known for the series of photographs I shot of 48 Vietnamese refugees who managed to sail to Thailand on a 30-foot boat, only to be towed back to the open seas by Thai Marines." Adams actually won the Robert Capa Gold Medal from the Overseas Press Club in 1977 for this series of photographs in his photo essay, "The Boat of No Smiles," that was published in the Associated Press. The photo essay actually convinced the U.S. President Jimmy Carter to shelter 200,000 South Vietnamese refugees to the Vietnamese Boat People Asylum. The essay was presented to the United States Congress by the State Department and is widely credited with influencing the United States' decision to shelter these refugees. I would have rather won the Pulitzer for something like that. It did some good and nobody got hurt, Adams later remarks of the photo series. He also is known for other photo essays as well, such as Poverty in America and The Homeless. Photo essays weren't the only thing Adams did in his free time, though. He also contributed to numerous A Day in the Life books, including A Day in the Life of America in 2003 and A Day in the Life of U.S. Armed Forces. Not only this, but also his iconic images of Mother Teresa, Louis Armstrong, and Malcolm X. Eddie Adams left the Associated Press in 1972 to freelance for Time magazine and returned in 1976 as the organization's first and only special correspondent. A Time assignment to photograph Penthouse magazine's Bob Guccione led to a commission to photograph a series of Penthouse pets as well. After leaving the AP again in 1980, Adams spent the next 2.5 decades as a freelance photographer and a special correspondent for Parade magazine. Adams ended up shooting over 350 covers for the magazine before his reign ended. He covered 13 wars and shot portraits of such luminaries as Pope John Paul II, Richard Nixon, and George Bush. Adams also used his work for charity. He shot the Parade cover every year for the Jerry Lewis Muscular Dystrophy Association telethon issue. In 1988, he founded Barnstorm, the Eddie Adams Workshop, a free 4-day intensive for selective, aspiring photojournalists, staffed by some of the nation's top photographers and journalists, and held at Adams Farm in upstate New York. Adams could even get others to spur towards charity. In 1995, a photograph of a 3-year-old child with leukemia, part of a photo essay for Parade on the most beautiful children in the world, instigated the creation of Project Linus. The organization provides security blankets to children who are seriously ill, traumatized, or otherwise in need. Eddie Adams' legacy lives on through his yearly Eddie Adams Workshop and through his archive that is housed at the Dolph Briscoe Center for American History at the University of Texas at Austin. The archive was actually donated by his widowed wife, Alyssa Adams, and documents Adams' career. Measuring 200 linear feet in size, the Eddie Adams Photographic Archive includes slides, negatives, prints, audio and video materials, news stories, diaries, notes, and tear sheets, in addition to his substantial coverage of the Vietnam War. The collection includes his in-depth features in Poverty in America, The Homeless, Mother Teresa, Brazil, Alternative Society, anti-war demonstrations, and riots, as well as his intimate portraits of high-profile people including Ronald Reagan and Clint Eastwood. In May of 2004, Adams was diagnosed with amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, or Lou Gehrig's disease. Following the diagnosis, he continued to work and continued with plan for Barnstorm. In addition, he also created a video profile of himself that was featured during the Jerry Lewis Muscular Dystrophy Association telethon to raise awareness for his disease. Eddie Adams died on September 19, 2004. He is survived by his wife and son, August, as well as 3 children from his previous marriage to Anne Federchak. People who knew him say the photographer had an intense desire to be perfect, so book projects were always delayed. It wasn't until 4.5 years after his death that EddieAdams' Vietnam was published. With the pressure to be perfect hovering over his shoulders, Adams also managed to be awarded more than 500 photojournalism awards throughout his career, including the George Polk Award for News Photography in 1968, 77, and also 78. As quoted in News Photographer magazine after his death by former AP photography director Hal Buell, he had a way of taking an idea an editor would suggest and building upon it, making it more than an idea or suggestion. He made it a picture.